So this video is essentially a very analytical exhibition of dreams and consequently dream worlds as a narrative tool within Omori and Yume Nikki. And if that doesn't immediately make sense to you, just sit back, enjoy the video, and I'm sure it will at some point.
Much more than that, I'm sure, but I do distinctly remember one period where I hardly ever left the room for a 3-month period.
What were you doing in there?
Well, that's a good question.
Yume Nikki discloses information to you in a very interesting way that games since really haven't sought to emulate, save for maybe Lisa the First and a handful of other indie titles. The idea of having a dream world be a very essential part of the narrative allows for very seemingly small things to be the linchpin in theme establishment. Take, for example, the very famous refusal of opening the door, something that's referenced numerous times within Omori. It's hardly notable unless you parallel it with the idea that in Midatsuki's dreams, the gameplay is very much exploratory, which flies right in the face of the sentiment that we received when trying to leave the house. Speaking of the dream world, another thing that's very much worth noting is the seemingly independent nature of Midatsuki's dream world. Not too dissimilar from real life, the dream world continues and does whatever it wants, irregardless of anything you do. The NPCs in particular can't really be interacted in any traditional human way, and this makes the dream world feel like a very lonely place, which further exemplifies the very powerful themes of isolation in this game in a very tangible, hands-on way that the player can feel through their gameplay experience. And of course, lastly, if you venture to your balcony, the only other place where you can go in the real world, you might notice that the backdrop changes occasionally to convey the passing of time. A lot of time passes while you're playing Yume Nikki, and during this time your character really doesn't do anything besides sleep. Now, of course, this gives way to the most apparent theme, which is extreme reclusivity and isolation, but it leaves the door open for other things. For example, the very idea that your character's dreams simply consist of exploring and going places perhaps hints at a want to leave the house, but something prevents that from happening. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole smorgasbord of different themes that Yume Nikki explores in very much the same way it does this one, but what I'm trying to explain here is that this concept of a pseudo-physical world, derivative of this character's psyche, is an immensely powerful world-building tool, specifically in a psychological horror game, a genre that's even weaker in video games than it is when it comes to movies. This concept is so significant on a narrative level for Yume Nikki that it ties together gameplay that in any other game would be a complete failure of game design, the inability to interact with anything around you. The seemingly aimless goal of the game is tied together by the fact that the entire world is almost like a physical manifestation of a character study. It's truly brilliant stuff.
Tiny room he's barely left in the last decade. He's a hikikomori, Japanese word for a person who seeks isolation.
I often stay in my futon the whole day and just stare at the ceiling.
Now, while Omori does tell its story in a much more conventional way than Yume Nikki, there are elements of Yume Nikki's style of quote-unquote storytelling that do permeate the world of Omori. The most obvious comparison to make is that, like in Yume Nikki, Omori has a dream world. However, unlike Yume Nikki, where the dream world in question has been made manifest by a subconscious mind consumed by fears, Omori's dream world is conversely made in an effort to cope with a significant trauma that occurred within the main character Sunny's life. Unlike Yume Nikki's dream world that appears nightmarish and terrifying, Omori's dream world is very vibrant and enjoyable to look at, contrasted with the real world in Omori that possesses much flatter, more standard color theory. The harsh contrast between the exceedingly mundane and the extremely jovial nature of the dream world emits this passive melancholy that occurs once you see the former only after experiencing the dream world. The incongruencies between these two worlds sets up reality to be this less than desirable place. Speaking of the dream world in question, a lot of people seem to miss the significance of the black light bulb. Now, if we were to take a traditional a light bulb in cartoons or pretty much anything is supposed to symbolize this sort of eureka effect creation of an idea. So there's a lot to be said about a light bulb that, for all intents and purposes, emits the antithesis to light. We can say that a black light bulb symbolizes the antithesis of an idea, the suppression or destruction of an idea, or to go even further, perhaps the suppression of reality itself. Another thing I thought was rather brilliant is Mari and Basil's adjacency towards your party. Now, it's very much safe to say that Mari and Basil are probably the two most important people in Sunny's life. At least among his friends, anyways. Mari being somebody who he cherished very deeply, as is shown in the game, and Basil, of course, being his best friend. That's why it's interesting that they are not party members that you have in the game, and of course that can be chalked down to gameplay purposes. A 4-party system is a lot easier to balance than a 6-party system. However, that is simply a meta extension of components in the narrative were shown later on, that because of Mari and Basil's inherent connection to reality and truth, they simply cannot have the same closeness in Sunny's dreams that Sunny's other friends have. Concept we're going to be delving into a little bit later. Now, unlike Yume Nikki, Omori doesn't necessarily need these tiny little minutiae I spoke of to establish its themes or ideas, but it certainly does help add a lot of texture to the world. Omori's world is one that, on the surface level, is incredibly joyous, but of course that's totally subversive, as the entire dream world itself is a symbol of repression, a symbol of stagnation in the main character's life. And that idea is given to the player in such a particular way that gives Omori this uniquely sad atmosphere. Ergo, those previous things I mentioned, plus a litany of many others that we'll be delving into later on in the video, make returning to the dream world a bit of a bittersweet thing. Its total artifice nature makes it sad inherently, despite how overly joyous it is in appearance.
You look familiar. Hey, you must be...
In Yume Nikki, it is by scrupulously observing the surroundings in the world that you can get a fair idea of what Madatsuki's surroundings are outside of the house. Take, for example, the Toraningen. The Toraningen are basically the only enemy within Yume Nikki, but that's not what's interesting about them. What is peculiar about them is the fact that they have a unique group dynamic not exhibited by any other living thing within the game. Now, there's a lot to be said about a game in which you play as an isolationist who acts alone within their dreams, and their only enemies are things that act within a group. Additionally, at one part in the game, the Toraningen themselves do something that is uniquely incredibly human. Not to mention their very humanoid, albeit strange, appearance. And once again, this concept of dream symbolism allows us to enrich this information beyond what it would normally represent, and now the Toraningen are stand-ins for this warped looking glass into this character's history. The Toraningen begin to represent her history with social circles, her ostracization with social circles, and her history of bullying. And of course, their monstrous appearance shows that this sentiment is mutual. She views these groups, these cliques, as undesirable. This is the precedent the game uses in order to show Madatsuki as a person, her history, her personality. The image that's formulated ultimately is somebody who's been traumatized greatly throughout the majority of their life to such a significant degree that the memories of these traumatic events follow her into the recess of her mind, where they feature themselves most prominently in her dreams. It very quickly turns the Yume Nikki game world, which is esoteric and indecipherable, into pretty much the definitive idea of what a psychological horror world would look like, this total manifestation of this character's broken history. A similar but different concept is showcased in Omori. Now, because Omori does have an actual fleshed out real world, you can actually examine incongruencies between the two to draw a few conclusions about Sunny's character and of course the world he lives in through the lens of the fact that it is his perception of reality. A notable example of this is the fact that any time spent with Omori's dream friends is often within the context or influenced by something from Omori's childhood within the context of the dream. So for example, Sprout Mole's space boyfriend, Sweetheart, and even Humphrey are all toys or pop culture things that Omori used to fraternize with frequently during his childhood. And the idea that in his dream they have such an important impact on the ecosystem and world within it kind of shows how important that section of his life is. There is no greater example of this dream upscaling than the Big Yellow Cat. The Big Yellow Cat is massive in Sunny's dreams, absolutely huge. To the contrary of its real-life origins of this very furtive, easily missable cat calendar. What's more interesting about it, still, spoilers for the Hikikomori ending of the game, the Big Yellow Cat sort of has this very physical connotation of Sunny's stagnation as a human being and his fixation on trying to preserve and live in the past. In the Hikikomori ending, as anybody who's played it may know, the Big Yellow Cat is what resets the dream world. It makes this return to normalcy from the events that have disrupted it that occurred during the game. There's something really beautiful that in Sunny's dreams, this thing that in real life is supposed to represent the archiving of past time and the oncoming passage of time is now strongly correlated with stagnation, the cessation of time moving forward at all. I think that's really, really clever. This gives Sunny a lot of character where there otherwise really wouldn't be. Sunny's what I like to call an implied vocal protagonist, as in, it's implied he speaks, but there's really no sentences or dialogue to pick apart coming from his end. Hi, it is posthumous, Boy Afraid. Editor's note for you. I was gonna interject that classic pop culture joke in which, you know, that Lassie joke where they go, oh, what's that, Lassie? Timmy fell down the well? Oh, we better go save him. You know that? I was going to interject it right here, and then guess what? I found out that doesn't actually exist. That is the biggest cultural Mandela effect ever. Ever. By a massive margin. Insane. Anyways, just want to share. Enjoy the rest of the video. But the game has a cavalcade of different non-verbal ways of telling you who he is and how interesting his character actually can be, as well as taking full advantage of the fact that since the narrative is centered around dreams, he can have a lot of internal dialogues with himself under that pretense. This, of course, pairs very nicely with Madatsuki, who is totally and completely silent during Yume Nikki. But if you take one cursory glance at the large assortment of Yume Nikki fan art, there's a pretty succinct idea of who Madatsuki is, despite the fact that the game has to convey it to you in this very esoteric means, right? But once again, the games both take very, very good advantage of the narrative of a dream and how dreams can be very impactful on a symbolic level, and of course what they can say about the people who are creating them. Moving on, these perceptive incongruities I mentioned aren't just limited to objects, namely Sunny's closest friends, who when compared to their real-life counterparts feel very caricaturish. This of course has to do with the fact that these characters are depictions within Sunny's mind from over 4 years ago. Every character, even the minor ones, follow this rule. All of them except for one. Basil is incredibly exceptional in Sunny's dream world, in the sense that Basil is the catalyst for anything outside of the normativity of the very tame, simplistic world that is the dream world being even remotely disrupted. Now, of course, going off the implication of looking at Omori's laptop and dialogue within the dream world, it's safe to say that this is an area that's frequented, and considering the activities that the friend group tends to partake in, a kidnapping usually isn't on the menu. However, what is more significant about Basil's kidnapping is not that it happens, but what he's taken by. Now, I've seen a great many interpretations of what something could represent within the world of Omori, but the one that I tend to subscribe to the most is guilt, this pervasive, looming albatross that occasionally presents itself within Sunny's life the more he seeks to run from it. On a symbolic level, there's a huge degree of significance in the sense that a depiction of what Basil was way back when is taken from the guilt of an event that Basil is so closely related to. But still, more significant than that is the fact that Omori's dream world doesn't actually seem very interested in finding Basil. Now, you might be telling yourself right now, this guy is, he's a moron. This is the dumbest thing he said so far.
False, wrong, incorrect, negative.
However, if you were to, think for a second, right? You would realize that nothing Omori or his friends do in the dream world really amounts to finding Basil. All of the large story beats in the game, the events that happen within the dream world, are not at all related to Basil. And during the last portion of the game, Omori's friends not only forget what Basil looks like, but seem to forget him as a whole, going so far as to trash one of his belongings under the pretense that, why would anybody want this thing? Who would want this thing? And appropriately enough, the only place you can find Basil is Black Space. Also the only place that Omori's dream friends do not want to go and actively advise Omori not to venture to. Speaking of Black Space, one of the great many events that Black Space has to offer is one in which Omori's dream friends brutally beat Basil to death. If we're to look a little bit too far into this, perhaps that shows a degree of deliberate avoidance of this person, this threat to the ecosystem that is Basil. But why is Basil a threat to the ecosystem? Now, as most of you may know, Basil is inexorably connected to Mari's death, but not in the way that you might think. It is my belief that Mari didn't die until after being hung on the tree. Allow me to explain. Mari is shown to have fallen down the stairs and had her eyes closed for a great deal of time, so Sunny brings her to bedroom, tries to get a response out of her, doesn't work. Basil then proposes the idea of setting it up so it looks like a suicide in order to protect Sunny. On their way back into the house, Sunny and Basil look back only to find an eye staring at them through a bunch of hair falling downwards, presumably because of the way that she's hung. That, to me, is a very, very poignant reference to the idea that Mari was still alive up until being hung there, and by the time they looked back, there was nothing that could be done. This would make a sort of dichotomy between Sunny and Basil, in which they are both equally at fault. They both equally made terrible, terrible decisions in the heat of the moment that costed them dearly. This is corroborated by the fact that Basil consistently asks Omori or Sunny for forgiveness throughout the game, and makes more sense since Basil suffers a tremendous amount of guilt, and it feels a little bit less compelling if he's suffering guilt for being an accessory to murder. However, nothing I say is fact, merely speculatory, and you can take what you will from this video. This puts Basil and Sunny's relationship under an incredible strain, to the point where Sunny has great difficulty interacting with Basil in private and real life, and of course, on a much more subconscious level, Basil simply cannot exist in this perfect world that Sunny has crafted for himself in his dreams. If you don't know what I mean, try thinking about 2D Mario for a second, just a 2D Mario level. One of the first things you'd probably think of is Mario jumping basically adjacent to a hole. Maybe he's even jumping into it. This idea is inseparable for a lot of people who are familiar with 2D Mario games. Even if you try to put the image of a hole out of your mind, right, and you try to picture Mario without it, you have to put effort into doing that, and inevitably the next time you think of 2D Mario, that might be the first image that comes to mind. A similar concept, albeit on a more macrocosmic level, is observed within Omori. Later in the game, shortly after Humphrey, while you're going through this cave, a disembodied voice will begin to tell Sunny, not Omori, but Sunny, things about the depictions of his friends that he has within his dream world. And it'll begin to speak about how the depictions of Basil and Mari, specifically, are not as stable as the other ones. Their inherent relation to trauma forces these characters into places of adjacency when compared with the main cast. And these preventative measures only work to a degree, as you'll know by playing the game. Little segments where Sunny's inner speakers trying to get to him seem to slip through the cracks. In the Hikikomori ending, this is implied to be an ongoing cyclical issue where Sunny keeps trying to double down on this fake world and suppress the past. And that's what makes these characters so great, is because they're so integral to the thesis statement of the game, which is about self-forgiveness, which is about moving on from events that have happened in your past, because as we see in one of the many bad endings, the other solution has a far grimmer result. This concept is explored furtively within Yume Nikki, where any of the even remotely positive, nice areas within Madatsuki's dreams are suspect to nightmarish corruption congruent with the rest of her dream hellscape. Which, as we discussed earlier, has the very dark implication that even the nice thoughts that this character has are invaded by the overwhelming bad thoughts that often plague her dreams. And furthermore, Yume Nikki's ending bears a striking resemblance to Omori's bad endings, where this character, after weathering so much emotional damage, decides to take her own life. These two games have this very literally cerebral interpretation of a Greek tragedy that I'm so absolutely enamored with. The fact that anything of significance happens within the mind, this very personal battle being waged, is absolutely beautiful. And what's even better is that Omori takes this concept and goes even further with it and offers you a game about somebody who grows through these cerebral interactions and somebody who eventually spreads their wings and gets over this trauma that's been plaguing them for a great many years.